Thank you so much. First of all, I'd like to say what a privilege it is to have this opportunity. And I'd like to thank Melissa and Marissa for the invitation. Very kind to be here, to ask me to come. I always normally like, and if I'm not very familiar with the crowd, I like to ask, how many people have heard of Mr. Menaboni? How many people have never heard the name? Okay. And if you have heard of him, do you mainly associate him with birds? Yeah. So that's a good thing, because I hope tonight we'll share more insights. And a very nice lady I just met, she reminded me to say this, otherwise I would have forgotten, even though I see it in very large print across my paper. If you have a question while I'm speaking, please interrupt as we go. I'm going to have if we have time, you can ask questions at the end, but if you have a question while you're seeing something, or something comes to your mind, I would appreciate you asking, because that helps the program as well. So as Marissa said, I became interested in Mr. Menaboni because of my love for the Coca-Cola company, and Mr. Woodruff is my hero. And I was at Rich's department store in the late 80s, and I saw a stack of books called Menaboni's Birds. The book had been reissued. And I thought, I've heard this name, Menaboni. And so I picked it up, and I thought, do I really want to pay $17 for this book? And I decided, when I flipped it open, there were a lot of paintings in the book that belonged to Mr. Woodruff. So that's the reason that I purchased it. And then I eventually was able to meet Sarah and Athos and have my book signed and that type thing. But Mr. Menaboni was born in Livorno, Italy. And if you're not quite sure where that is, it's on the West Coast. And it was close enough that he could ride his bicycle to Pisa when he was a kid. So he would go there and admire the architecture. He loved art even as a young child. He was very talented and had no interest in his father's business. His family was very prominent. For example, in their town, his family knew Puccini and Mosconi, and even sold Puccini his first car, which I think is very interesting. But his main business, his dad's business, was a ship's chandler, which they provide all the supplies to all the boats, because Livorno is a port city. And so, again, Athos had no interest, and so he began to show great talent in art. And I know at the Troup County Archives, our oldest work is of a sailboat that he did when he was 6 years old. And so his father provided lessons with a sculptor, muralist, as well as a marine painter. Because to me, when I see Athos's water, I don't think anybody can paint water better than he can. So after the war, he was in World War I and was actually one of the first pilots. He was so distraught by what he had observed that he felt like he needed to get away to have a new start to life. And plus, in Italy, it was there were already a lot of artists and musicians. So he felt like if he was going to make a career for himself, he needed to move to the United States, which he did in 1921. He first went to New York City, where he stayed almost 3 years. He didn't prefer New York, mainly because he was still struggling learning English, but also the crowd. He was not very fond of lots and lots of people. So New York would not be for someone like that. So he had an opportunity to go to Davis Islands in Florida. There was a big land boom in Florida. And this is in Tampa. And if you notice at in the center, at the very bottom of this ad, you'll see his name, because he was the art director and designed this ad and other ads for the newspapers and other publications. But there's a building that he designed in 1925. It's still there. He designed the front elevation, so not like he was an architect, but just the outside, and it's based on a palace in Florence. So in 1927, that was just after the land boom ended in Florida, and many of the people went bankrupt. And so Athos had an opportunity to come to Atlanta. Mainly, we're not quite sure why, but most of us feel like there was a connection to an acquaintance that he made in New York that was connected to Mr. Schutze, Philip Schutze. And so we think there was some connection with that particular move, because one of his first projects is something that I'll mention in just a minute, but he moved to a boarding house on Peachtree Street, which happened to be owned by the uncle of his future wife, Sarah. And just a quick story that I normally tell. Some of my friends are here, so I hate for them to hear the joke again, but Athos's mother was very religious, devout Catholic. And of course, you can imagine how she would feel with her son moving so far away and not being able to see him. But she was happy for him and wanted him to be successful. But her only prayer was that he never marry an American woman. And the reason for that is because women smoked cigarettes, and they went out without chaperones, all kinds of things like that. So word came that Athos was marrying a woman from Rome. And so I was told by Athos and Sarah that his mother literally dropped to her knees to thank God. And they said, "But Mother, it's not Rome, Italy." And she said, "It doesn't matter, it's still Rome." But it was love at first sight, and Sarah and Athos spent 2 months in Rome and traveling throughout Italy and to meet his family. Now, I mentioned Mr. Schutze, but before we go into a little bit of detail about him, another very important early patron was J.J. Haverty of Haverty Furniture. And so the downtown Rhodes Haverty building, which is now a Marriott Residence Inn. And for years, I thought I looked it up and I couldn't find it where I thought it was, but I'm sure it was over 2 decades. This building was the tallest building in Atlanta. Ken, maybe you might know. I'm not sure, but I'm thinking 27, 28 years. But in the lobby of the Rhodes Haverty building, Mr. Menaboni was commissioned to do this Renaissance Florentine ceiling, which is still there today. And another project he did with Mr. Haverty was for the chapel of St. Joseph's Hospital. This is when it was downtown. It was called an infirmary. And you'll see 2 angels on each side in the front. And I'll say something about the one on the left first, because it's now in Dublin, Ireland. And what it fascinates me is the person who unveiled it was the ambassador to Ireland. And at the time, it was President Kennedy's sister, Jean Kennedy Smith. And then the other archangel survives, and it's in the lobby of the current St. Joseph's Hospital, which is now part of Emory. So in between commissions, he would paint paintings from his homeland. This is called a beccolino, and it's mainly a supply ship, and it would travel up and down man-made canals between Livorno to Pisa to Florence and back. So it could carry food, other goods. And then he also painted landscapes. This one happens to be somewhere in North Georgia. I'm not sure where, but he enjoyed doing things like that. And he did have some exhibitions in the late 20s where he sold work like this. Two projects that I wanted to mention that were in Macon. This is, you can see 4 or 5 murals on the left for the main banking room of the C&S Bank. This was done in the early 30s. And the subjects dealt with Georgia or local history in Macon. And so I thought you might like to see one. They all survive. And this one happens to be at Wesleyan College. It's James Oglethorpe. And then another project he did was the Shriners Temple, and this building also survives, where the main ballroom has an Egyptian theme. And I've been told that most people feel that the main connection to Egypt was about the time they discovered King Tut's tomb. So everyone was so interested in Egypt, and so this was a perfect idea to bring this forward. So if you look on the left, you'll see the main entrance, and then this is just a close-up view of the art that's over the door. But this room is completely painted floor to ceiling, and even in the windows, I know there's a term, but I don't know what it is. But this part of the window, even these are painted. So it's covered in paint, but I'm very happy that it survives. It was going to be turned into a venue for events like they use this room for here, but COVID came and that plan sort of dropped. But the building is still safe and taken care of. Now, another thing that he was very famous for, because you remember that I mentioned that he painted murals. Troup County has a lot of mural studies, and this one is actually titled Mother Earth Bestowing Gifts to Chattanooga. And it's obvious that it's Chattanooga when you notice the mountain in the background, because Lookout Mountain has such a distinctive shape. Now, I wanted to say a few things about Philip Schuetze, because he's one of the most prominent architects. I'm not going to mention or show any slides of Swan House, because I'm sure most of you have been there. But I did want to tell you a story that you might not be familiar with. His main work there is upstairs in Mrs. Inman's dressing room. And what is so unusual, Mr. Menaboni, I heard this with my own ears. He didn't really criticize, but he was so shocked by her request. Mr. Schuetze had imported the very finest pink Italian marble for this room. And after she moved in, she didn't like it. And it was not worth, I really don't know the story behind why it wasn't just removed, but she had Mr. Menaboni come in and faux paint the pink marble green and white. And he said he was rather uncomfortable doing it, but he said, I needed a job. And, that was money. And so also in the room on the ceiling, you'll see swans. But this is one of my favorite homes, and you can visit if you're ever interested. It's now a house museum on West Paces Ferry. It's the May Patterson Goodrum House. And his main work is in the breakfast room. So he painted the ceiling, which I'll show you a close-up in just a second. But there are 4 shelving niches. They're all painted over the lunettes over 2 doors, and then there's 4 oval paintings over each shelf. And so this is just one section where I included the bird and the dragonfly. Now, what I tried to do, because we're here in DeKalb County, I wanted to also mention several things associated specifically with the county. And unfortunately, there's good news, and the good news is almost every work by Mr. Menaboni in terms of his large projects have survived. But this was one that was lost at Glen Ridge Hall. You know, when that home was destroyed to build the headquarters for Mercedes-Benz, which was a real tragedy. A lot of the murals they're either in the same location or they've been carefully removed by conservators. And they tried to save this, but this was actually painted directly on the wall, whereas a lot of his other murals, it was like a canvas wallpaper, so very easily removed. Now back to Mr. Schuetze. This is on Sapelo Island, R.J. Reynolds, the tobacco man. And unless you're familiar with R.J. Reynolds Mansion, I would bet, and I'm not a betting person, I don't even win Monopoly when I play Monopoly, you would never guess that this is Menaboni's work because it's so unusual. But the circus room, there's animals and disfigured humans like you would see at a circus back in the old days, snakes, monkeys. So this is one corner, and the tent, the ceiling is still the original. And what's interesting, I don't have any photographs of the individuals painted on the wall, but many of them were friends of Mr. Reynolds. And the ringmaster, they say, was or is Mr. Reynolds. My favorite room is the sunroom, solarium, which has sort of a jungle theme, and it was also connected to the indoor swimming pool. Another Schuetze home, it's really quite stunning if you see the whole thing, but it's a home, very unusual home where the hall goes through the entire length of the house in an L shape, so it goes down the entire, all the way to the end, and then turns left to the side door. And this is the Patterson Carr home. If you remember Patterson Funeral Home, this was his home. And so Mr. Menaboni painted a large forest of dogwood, blooming dogwoods, and included birds and things like that. So by the end of the 30s, he was in another lull, and so he just happened to paint a cardinal. Now, this is not the cardinal he painted, but he just painted a cardinal for his own home. And one of their best friends was Molly Eck. Some of you may know Tony Eck, the architect. His parents were the Menaboni's best friends. So she was an interior designer. And she walked in and saw this painting and said, that's something that's really perfect for my client. And so, as you know, one thing led to another, and then his career entirely. Now, they lived in a bird sanctuary. They had 6 acres in what is now what we would call Sandy Springs, but it's on Crest Valley Drive near Powers Ferry and not too far from Chastain Park, Mount Perrin Church. And so he had an aviary, a studio. He built his home there. And very close to their front door, he built this as an inspiration of St. Francis. That was someone he greatly admired, who was the patron saint of all animals. Now, another interesting project with Mr. Schuetze was with the Capital City Club. Now, this is a mirror that was actually on exhibition at Kennesaw State University, but it's now back down at the club. He painted in reverse 15 sheets of glass, and it was a very, very technical and difficult thing to do. And I won't go into all the details. I'm happy to if you have a question about how he did it. At first, he tried to use a mirror, but it made him sick at his stomach, gave him a headache. So he actually just had to go back and forth. And you had to paint the details first. So if there's a bird, he might paint the eye first and then work his way out, which is just the opposite of how you would normally do a painting. And his wife was very proud, and she should be. She played an important role because she used his same brushes to go back and add varnish when the paint was still just a little bit tacky. And so she covered it in varnish because when these were taken to be silvered, had she not done her job correctly, the paint would have dissolved. And so she was always very delighted to tell people her part, which as I said, she should. Now, again, my hero is Mr. Woodruff, and he was Mr. Menaboni's greatest patron. And if you've lived in Georgia any time, I'm going to bet that you have seen at some point, maybe even when you were in elementary school, this particular painting, but may not realize that it is Menaboni. But it's his most widely publicized work and was actually first commissioned by Mr. Woodruff, and it appeared on his 1948 Christmas card. Now, I brought one example if some of you'd like to see it, but he and Mr. Menaboni created a Christmas card series that includes 44 cards covering 43 years, 1941 to 1984. And so as time progressed, people began to collect these. But like I said, the 1948 card, Mr. Woodruff decided to have lithographs made.
Do you know if a 3D porcelain piece has been made from this painting?
The only one that I know, it's actually a holiday ornament for a tree that was made to benefit the Georgia archives and sold at the Capitol. But I don't know of any porcelain that has been done based on any Menaboni birds. But Mr. Woodruff had lithographs made in 1950, and these were given to all the public schools and libraries in Georgia. And what I think if you know anything about Mr. Woodruff, to me, I'm always amazed to think that he was so actively involved in the detail of something like his Christmas card. You would think he would not care. Or maybe not, that might not be the right way to say it, but be too busy and let other people handle things. But the routine was Mr. Menaboni would always be called maybe sometime in March, but definitely by April. And he knew that he would be there all day. This is year after year after year after year. He would get there around 9 o'clock. And the first question, even though they were great admirers of each other, it was always a professional relationship. It was always Mr. Menaboni, Mr. Woodruff, even though Mr. Menaboni was invited to his South Georgia home to hunt and things like that. And Mr. Woodruff would go to their home as well, but it was still always a professional relationship. But the first question Mr. Woodruff would ask, well, what have you thought about? Do you have an idea for a bird? And Mr. Menaboni would say, I do. We haven't done a wood duck. No, I don't think so. That's just not right. You know, that doesn't seem like the holiday, and, you know, people eat ducks and, you know, that kind of thing. So this would go on all day, and Mr. Menaboni said that, you know, literally the president might call, the governor might call, people coming in and out, secretaries coming to have this. And finally, around 4:15, he would be called back into Mr. Woodruff's office, and he would say, I have the idea. I think it should be a wood duck. And that literally happened every year. And I don't mean it as a criticism. I mean it with affection, but it was his card. He was commissioning it. He was paying for it, but it had to be his idea. But to give you an example of this one painting, and then I'm going to move on. I'm sort of getting bogged down. That's why I should be using my notes. He wrote a letter to Mr. Menaboni after he saw this painting, and he said, "Have you ever seen a bird nest in a Cherokee rose?" He began to question many aspects, and he said, "I thought a Cherokee rose was pink. And do you think it's appropriate to use on a card?" Well, you obviously know that the answer turned out to be yes. And Mr. Menaboni, we have the letter that he wrote back to Mr. Woodruff and answered very politely, Cherokee rose is white. And he had not seen a bird nest in a Cherokee rose, but in a bush very similar to a Cherokee rose. So he thought it was okay. But here's another example. This is 1953. And this is not my favorite painting, but I think it's very interesting, so I wanted to share it. Mr. Woodruff overheard a group of men at Itchaway before they went out to hunt quail. They were arguing over the flight speed of game birds. And so Mr. Woodruff decided to have Mr. Menaboni research the speed, the actual speed, and then paint this work to illustrate. And to me, the most fascinating is the third fastest, which is a wild turkey, because it's so large. He also did, we know, at least one work for Coca-Cola. What's so sad is we only know of one that exists. You go to the archives at Coca-Cola, and even something that's 100 years old, they might have a dozen of them, or 2 dozen of every truck, and all. They only have one of these, and we've never been able to find another one. So it's very special. But they were used as advertising, and so when they came down, a new one came in, they were just thrown away. Now, one of my favorite items, and I think this will prove to you, in my opinion, that there is fate, because, and I brought one of these as well, if you'd like to see it up close. But it's the only calendar that Mr. Menaboni did. It's for Coca-Cola, and it's the year I was born. And so that's very, very special to me. But it's called a home calendar. It's not like you would see in the drugstore. It's very small. But in the early 40s, they moved to a period of, they talked Mr. Menaboni into selling lithographs. And he was very skeptical because he felt like it could take away from his question. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Okay. He thought it might take away from sales of originals. But these were actually produced by the National Audubon Society. And then another group that's very, very important, this company probably did a dozen or so. It's a stationery company called Montag, if any of you remember that. Local Atlanta company, although they had a store in New York City. But they sold stationery, but how I remember Montag is when I was a child, they made Blue Horse notebooks and Blue Horse notebook paper, so that's what I used in school. Now, another great patron, and we're going to mention a few things about Mills B. Lane, and then we're going to come back to him at the end because I'm going to tell you more detail about the eggshell mosaic. But Mills B. Lane was the president of C&S Bank for Georgia. And this was the Mitchell Street building, and he commissioned Mr. Menaboni to paint a number of murals. This is in the main banking room, and you see the mural on the far side. And then it was removed in 2012. And this is when it was on exhibition at Kennesaw State University. And at the time, it was the second largest mural in Georgia, 640 square feet. And I don't know where it stands now, but of course, Cyclorama is number one. Today, it has a permanent home at Clayton State University in their student center. And you see the white space. There was a lot of discussion with the conservator about what to do where the door, part of the door was, and also the small box is where the exit sign was. And she just decided to keep it, as is and not try to, because Mr. Menaboni actually painted on site here. This was not created in a studio and then installed. So he never painted anything for that spot, and it was cut out. Now, another connection to DeKalb County is it was once called the Cerebral Palsy School, but it's now the Fraser Center over on Ponce. And so this is a mosaic, 44,000 pieces of Murano glass. He used to. What's that?
Did he work alone when he painted? Did he do all this himself?
He did. Now, the mural, the previous mural, he did have an apprentice, and it's the only project that we know of where someone else also signed the canvas. So all of these things he created by himself.
Where that is?
He said it's imaginary. That's a good question, because I talked about this in February at a symposium I spoke, and so I did a lot of research and he tried to describe. So it's just, there's not a particular bird, it just came out of his head. But he did this his mom had died in 1958, so he did this in memory of her and then donated it to the Fraser Center. Now, the connection that might interest you is Millsby Lane had a child that had cerebral palsy. So his wife founded this school that still exists today. Now, a medium that I wanted to mention, and there's a reason why we'll come back to that towards the end, it's called Nakora wood, and it's a very distinctive grain. The tree is now extinct. It grew in the Philippines and was processed in Japan. And it was mainly used to panel people's rooms in people's homes. But he found it on a trip to Japan and then decided to panel his studio. But then he began to see things in the grain. And so to me, when I look at this particular painting, I actually see, like you could see where the wind has blown the sand, as well as maybe waves in the water. But he would paint fish and other things on this type of wood. I thought you'd like to see a painting where he's actually working on the painting at his easel. And this painting here is one that he hoped to sell to Mr. Woodruff in 1976 for the bicentennial. But one thing that Mr. Woodruff did stick to the entire 44 cards was there would be no bird of prey. And one of his favorite birds was red-tailed hawk, but he would not allow that to be on a card. And so he didn't allow the bald eagle to be on the card to celebrate the 200th birthday. But he did suggest this. It was his idea, and it's the only card that around the painting, there are blue grosbeaks, but he put a blue border and a red border around the birds to help celebrate the birthday. Now, this happens, just to show you a little bit, something that's different. This happens to be one of my favorite paintings, and it's of his hometown, and the Tower of Marzocco is in the background. It's a tower that was built in the 14th century and still stands today. But again, I love how he paints water, and he actually painted this painting when he was 84 years old. Now, another connection to DeKalb County is the transom at the Woodruff Library at Emory. And this was originally built for an office for Mr. Woodruff. He never used it, but President Carter did after he returned to Georgia after his term. And so the fifth floor, I don't remember now how many floors, maybe 10. Anyway, the top floor is where rare books and the archives are housed. And it's all been remodeled, but the transoms, the transom with the two mallards have remained. And at one time they even had drapes that had reeds, so when the drapes were closed, it looked like the ducks were flying above the reeds. Now, what I wanted to end on is a little bit about the eggshell mosaic. How many of you have seen that at the Brickstore Pub? Okay. Well, it's only across the street, so you've got to see it at some point. Now, I've got some things that I wanted to read so I wouldn't forget any of the details. So now I will go to my notes. But this project, what I don't know is if I'm going to guess that it was Mr. Menaboni's idea to do this project, and then Mr. Lane allowed him to do it. But this was for the branch on Clairmont Road, and I specifically looked when I was driving here today. If you go out Clairmont from here, right before you get to North Decatur, it's the building that now says Emory Alliance, if you know where that is. So the building still stands. So this project was one of Menaboni's most unique creations. It's 4.5 feet tall and 27 feet in length. And it's a mosaic mural made of painted eggshells, which was installed on the wall behind the tellers at the Clairmont Road building. For its theme, the artist chose the biblical passage, "Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap." And this is how it looks today. Now, it's up high, and because it's in a restaurant, Melissa made them put plexiglass and those kind of things to protect it. And so it's very difficult to photograph. But I hope you can get an idea about how and it's separated by how it's installed. So, but it spans the growing season. And if you look from left to right, it's seed time to harvest and incorporates the four elements of nature indispensable to life. Fire, which you might can see. Earth is represented by a deer. Air is represented by birds, and water is represented by fish. This rarely used art form dates back to the old Italian masters of the 15th century, and some consider this work to be Menaboni's finest artistic achievement. The entire mosaic was developed in the form of a triptych, and it's hard to see here, but on each end it's separated by the Nakora wood panels. And so it looks like three in the middle, but that's actually one, just because of the way that it's installed. So he started out I told you that it's 4.5 feet tall, but it's done in 15 sections that are 1.5 feet in length, and then later assembled. So 2 panels are the Japanese Nakora wood, so that's why I wanted to include that painting earlier so you could see what he decided to do with this. And so they would flank the larger center unit. And then this is directly from the brochure that was created in 1958. So on each small section consisting of tempered fiberboard, he first outlined his design. He then covered a small portion of the board with ceramic adhesive, after which the intricate mosaic pattern was formed by putting the eggshell fragments into place by hand. The natural colors of the shells, varying from white through the many shades of brown, were employed as an integral part of the design. When all the sections had been so treated, they were assembled to form the final design, after which the artist painted in the remaining colors. The mural took 10 months to complete, and it's estimated that 3,200 eggshells were needed. And the reason for so many is because only about half of each eggshell could be used because of breakage. And the shells were provided to, I don't know if anybody in here would remember, there was a restaurant called Heron's. And Heron's would be the main provider of the eggshells. And one quick story, if you don't mind, is because it's funny. His sister was a piano teacher, and many of the eggs were stored there until he needed them. And one of the students her name was Tina, and one of her students said, Miss Tina, you sure do eat a lot of eggs. And so then she'd have to explain why she was collecting eggshells for her brother. I'm sorry?
Was this technique using eggshells, was that, a historic technique? Or
Yes, it was. He studied the technique from books that he found the technique in several of the books that he had, and it's from the 15th century in Italy, where they actually used eggshells.
On site at his home over at Sandy's?
It was on site. The original studio, he actually painted in his living room when he first built his home, and then there was a studio built on the hill behind, and then he built a new studio that was connected to their home.
Is the home still there?
No, it was destroyed. Uh-huh. Why? Well, it was just a challenge. It was something that he thought he could do. He had never done it before. He had an opportunity to do it, and somebody was going to pay him to do it. And so it also, by this time, he was very, very busy painting birds. And even though he loved birds, he always said, nobody ever asked me to paint a turkey buzzard. Everybody wants a cardinal. Everybody wants a bluebird. Everybody. And so, yeah, that was his job. But I guess it's just like all of us in our job. We get a little bit tired of it sometime. So this gave him a unique opportunity to do something different. So it took him about 10 months to complete. And I already said that. I'm sorry. I'm repeating myself. I apologize. And so I told you about the eggshells and who provided them. So it actually remained at the bank until 1985. And then it was moved to another office building because the bank had closed, but it was incorporated into Bank of America. And then in the early 1990s, very fortunately, it was given to the DeKalb History Center, where they have taken such good care of it. And since 2012, it's been admired by patrons while enjoying an exceptional meal at the Brickstore Pub, which is right across the street. I'll give you a little bit closer view. And then an up-close view of the fish. Yes, sir. Very secure. How's that what? I assume it's just because of the adhesive he used, and as far as I know, Melissa, do you know of any that have ever fallen off or?
No.
Yeah, I don't notice any damage when I see it. Yeah, it was a long time because there's no, the History Center does not have a location large enough to install it. So Melissa worked very hard to find a place. And I believe she told me, or maybe the manager told me, that y'all had just signed another extension of, I don't know if lease is the right word, but it's going to be there at least 5 more years, and then hopefully they'll. Is that right? Or I'm not sure who. Maybe I had a dream.
I think you're going to tell me that.
What? They told me that, or did you say you told? Maybe you told.
No, we haven't signed it.
Oh, okay. Well, I was thinking when I brought things for the auction, I was thinking that might be when I was told, but I'm not sure. maybe I just said something I shouldn't have said. But I'd like to close with one of my favorite images of Sarah and Athos. It was made in 1987, 3 years before Athos died. But they really did have a true and wonderful relationship. They did not have any children, but as he painted, she would sit and read the newspaper, or she would read books to him. If he needed a magnolia limb, he would go out and get the magnolia. She would go out and get the magnolia for him. She was his main agent. And after he had finished a number of paintings, that's when she invited their best friends over for supper. Because, well, what's the latest Mr. Menaboni has painted? And she'd be able to show them, and hopefully they would get their checkbooks out. And, because they would have to eat. But Athos was very shy and very modest, and Sarah was just the opposite. But a wonderful lady, and she was a writer in herself, and many of her articles were published in the Atlanta Journal Sunday magazine, and she also wrote a book in which Athos illustrated called Menaboni's Birds, which I brought. Now, I just want to close by showing you a couple of things that I meant to show you while I was talking. But when I mentioned Montag, another great patron was Richard Rich from the Rich's department store. And if you remember the downtown store, they had the restaurant called the Magnolia Room. This is one of 5 menu covers that Athos did for the Magnolia Room. 3 were done in the late 40s, early 50s, and then there were 2 others that were done in the late 50s. But if you look at this is an old edition. When I hold it up, you'll laugh. But it's an old edition. But if you looked at a 2024 edition, Mr. Menaboni's birds are still in World Book. He was commissioned in 1957 to do water birds and raptors and a few songbirds. But they've definitely gotten their money's worth, because they still do it all these years later. Now, he also, the first year Sports Illustrated was published, he actually had 2 covers. And this is one that the date is October 10th, 1955. And what's interesting about this is that it had a fold out with pheasants. And so I think that's nice. But I appreciate your time. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer any.